You're listening to the Braver Angels podcast, a new way of talking politics. I'm your host, John Wood Jr. And I'm joined today by my co-host, very good friend of mine, brilliant, sharp individual who's brought a whole lot of value to Braver Angels. Many of you will know him. For those of you who do not, I am joined by Mr. Silas Kulkarni. Silas, how are you doing today, buddy?
I'm doing good. Thanks, John.
Excellent. It was good to have you on, my friend. And it is good to be joined by Miss Sheba Williams, the founder of Nolef Turns, a person with a remarkable life story and life's mission that we're about to hear all about for the benefit of our listeners today. Sheba, thank you so much for joining us on the Braver Angels podcast.
Yes, good afternoon. Thank you for having me.
Absolutely. Well, no, it is a pleasure and an honor. You had an appearance at a Braver Angels debate on HR 1 and voting rights relatively recently, where I know you made a strong impact on many people who are watching and attending that program. And I think that we're going to circle back and talk a little bit about that experience and the larger sort of issues of voting rights and race as we get further down in the conversation. But to start with, Sheba, I'd love for you to tell us, first of all, who you are, what is the nature of the work that you do, and what is the story that you bring with you into the work of advocating for the formerly incarcerated that gives you a perspective and an understanding of the experience and the challenges that people have coming out of the criminal justice system and seeking to reintegrate into society? Can you tell us about your work and your story?
Sure. So I'm Sheba Williams. I am the executive director and founder of a Richmond, Virginia-based nonprofit called Nolef Turns. We started our organization at the end of 2015, early 2016. We're actually coming up on our 5-year mark in October because my husband and I moved back to Richmond in 2012, and between the two of us, we had put in over 1,000 job applications and didn't receive one call back.
Oh, wow.
I was wrongfully convicted of a crime in 2004, and he was incarcerated at the age of 15, tried as an adult, and sentenced to 74 years. Clearly, he didn't do 74 years. He appealed a lot of his cases and ended up doing 10 years the first time. He violated after a year and a half and went back to prison for 8.5 years. So by the time he was 36, he had done more time in prison than out. We rebuilt, we reshaped, we started our own businesses. He got his CDL and things like that. But there was still a fundamental problem with getting people back to work and getting to the fundamental things that they need to be successful and not reoffend or go back into the system. And then everybody knows 2016, our national election led to a fight about voting rights. So our governor at the time, Governor Terry McAuliffe, who is also running for governor again this year, wanted to reinstate the rights of over 231,000 individuals who had been disenfranchised because of a felony conviction. It took a fight. Republicans took it to the Supreme Court and they rescinded those 231,000 people's rights. So we went door to door, street to street, corner to corner, knocking on doors, finding individuals who needed to get their rights reinstated so that they could be eligible to vote. And that's how we got really involved in the voting rights process. But over time, I found that there were so many barriers that come to a person after they have done their so-called state-sanctioned time. So, for instance, with me, I was only sentenced to 5 years of probation, but I was disenfranchised for 9 years because I was stuck on probation. Now, I don't know if people have followed, but the past special session, and we've had a ton of special sessions since 2020, our state passed House Bill, I think it's a joint resolution 555, where people who are on probation are allowed to vote. The only people who are restricted from voting are people who are in actual physical institutions, which is huge. It's a constitutional amendment that will take 2 passes through legislation, and then it'll be on the 2020 referendum 2020 ballot as a referendum for people to vote on at the end of 2022. So we're still fighting, we're still fighting for all of the fundamental rights of a person who has been convicted of a crime to be able to move past that conviction. And that is a long, sort of very brief description of like how I got into the work and why I'm so passionate about what I do at Nolef Turns.
Sheba, could you tell us more about the different program areas that Nolef Turns works in? Because when I first met you and I learned about all the work you do, I was just amazed at how such a small nonprofit could do so much work for so many people.
So sure. The very fundamental basis of our programming, which we put on pause for 2020 when the pandemic hit, the fundamental basis was making sure that people were able to find a job that paid well, so they were able to sustain themselves, find housing that was safe and affordable, reinstate their right to vote. Some people get involved in mentoring, some people get involved in advocacy work. What I learned over time was that we could do the best at programming that we could do, but if we didn't get involved in changing some of the policies and the laws that plague people, we would just be spinning our wheels. So in this past few special sessions and legislative process, we got involved in work to get the first expungement bill passed for people with past convictions. It passed on July 1, 2021, but we are not able to use that process until 2025 because of some data issues with Virginia State Police and their systems that need to be updated. We're trying to get it expedited in the next session or next special session because I think we have another one coming up in August. We abolished the death penalty in Virginia. We got rid of some probation reforms that were keeping people stuck on probation for years. We're doing some fines and fees work, but the real center of how we get so much done is we center community. We give people the tools that they need to be able to advocate for themselves. So while a lot of times we're indirectly related to where people go in their journey, we do train people on how to approach advocacy, how to get involved at the legislative level, not just during the 3 months that we have a General Assembly, but year round, getting in contact with legislators, getting in contact with employers and housing managers to try to gain second chance partners who will rent and employ people who have past convictions. We've worked with our Attorney General for Fair Housing to try to get some housing managers to see the benefit of housing people who have past convictions. So technically, whatever kind of comes up in the mix of our work is where we kind of jump in, and it's all intentional because people learn that there are so many barriers and there are so many intersectional things that come into play when we're talking about addressing a person's need. I always say we don't do traditional programming because each individual has different needs. Someone will come in and do an intake application and they may need housing. They may need help with signing up for social services or education programs, or they may need help navigating things like the 20-year look back period on a licensing application. Even though our Department of Corrections has all of these trades that a person can get while they're incarcerated, you still come home and have to fight with the licensing board to apply or even be eligible for your license sometimes. I am a licensed barber and instructor by trade. I lost my license for 16 months because they have a question on the application that says, have you been convicted of a crime in the past 20 years? Even though the barbering program is one of the most successful trades that Department of Corrections offers for individuals to reintegrate, the licensing board still looks back 20 years and will deny you your licensing for various different trades because of a conviction. So as things come up, we kind of jump on them and fight to make things fairer for people who have already done their state sanctioned time.
It is pretty amazing how much of the emphasis around the way we understand the criminal justice system falls on punishment and penalty, and yet sense to steer away from rehabilitation, reintegration in society. I think that it's easy to look at the system and think that once we send people to jail, that we lose our concern for them as human beings, forgetting the fact that they are going to be our neighbors, they are going to be ideally our coworkers and people we operate society with, as they come back into society, which should be what we want, right? So the work you're describing is fascinating and important. It makes me think. I have a friend named, I don't know if you're familiar with a man named John Ponder. He has an organization called Hope for Prisoners, which does very similar work. Does that name ring a bell by any chance?
Not right off.
They have a model where I guess part of what makes their programming approach somewhat distinct is that like your organization, I think that they have a range of community partners. In their case, one such partner is law enforcement, local police departments. And part of what they try to do is, I think, in sort of a restorative justice framework, in various ways, they try to build dialogue and trust between law enforcement and the community of ex-offenders in a way that helps foster reintegration into society and just generally a more sort of understanding environment between the community and police. Have you found in your work that there is a role for law enforcement to be a constructive partner in terms of setting the stage for a more effective culture of reintegration? And is there any appetite for that in your experience on the part of law enforcement?
So restorative justice is always a huge thing. Like, we don't understand the logic of punishment. There are victims groups that we work with who will say, it doesn't give me justice to have a person locked away forever, right?
Mhm.
So with law enforcement, especially with the summer's last events with like George Floyd and everybody talking about defunding the police and things, we have been in conversations in multiple groups with law enforcement to see how to better relationships in the community. And a lot of it starts from pre-entry, not getting to a point where you're arresting people and worried more about quotas and numbers than actually building with community to see how you prevent crime, right? Um, a lot of you have a lot of law enforcement officers who really want to have that relationship to make sure that the resources that are missing from most people, and if people don't know, a lot of crime happens because of lack of resources, because of disinvestment from different communities and things like that. So we were having conversations with policing and trying to figure out, how do we keep people from even going into these systems? There's a very real conversation with, and there's one officer in particular, Sergeant Carol Adams, who also runs a nonprofit for domestic violence victims, but she goes into the community and has conversations, and she's not just showing up when a crime has happened or when a thing has happened. She's actually taking the time to build with people to see, hey, before I show up on the scene of a crime and I don't take into consideration what happened to get us here, maybe I can address the people before this happens. Maybe I can contribute to communities that are underserved or under-resourced or, underinvested in. So that is something that we've been talking to Department of Criminal Justice Services and different law enforcement officers about, and also on the local level, talking to officers to see, like, how can the relationship be better before a person even gets into the system? And when we're talking about people who have been through the systems and who are returning home, we're seeing a shift in the conversation and the paradigm where more people with lived experience are being centered in the conversations to break these cycles. So whereas like before, you wouldn't have a person who had a past conviction be able to speak to a group of students to give them the path to avoiding these situations where they're getting involved in the juvenile and the adult criminal legal systems. And I think it's beneficial to utilize people who have the experience. One, to make sure that law enforcement officers see what happens after the arrest. What happens to a person's life following putting those handcuffs on and leaving them in a jail cell. So Yeah, that's absolutely something that is amazing, and I wish could be built upon more. But this is the beginning, and I think last year's events really sparked the conversation with law enforcement officers to say, how can we do better? How can we be better? And how can we contribute to working ourselves out of a job, right? For lack of better terms.
Understood. Silas, I'd like to follow up with a related question, then let you jump in really quick if you don't mind. But the related question is, when we talk about, when we talk about criminal justice reform and when we talk about engaging law enforcement, there's a partisan kind of, framing for that, which sometimes breaks it down in a way to where, the way people look at it is to say that, okay, so Republicans are for cops, people, Democrats are for the people who are victims of abuse by officers, and for people of color. And we sort of get locked into a bit of a binary where it can be difficult for us to not talk past each other on these issues. My question is this a straight up and down partisan kind of split where there's no meeting in the middle between the two sides in terms of how we can advance some of the reforms that you might like to see take place? Or are we seeing ways and spaces in which Republicans and Democrats may actually be coming together on some of these related issues? And if so, what does that look like?
So I think it's two-pronged. I think with the actual people, it is absolutely nonpartisan or bipartisan issue. When a person is arrested and they go through court and they go through jail or prison or probation or whatever it is they're sentenced to, nobody stops and says, are you Democrat or independent or Republican?
Right.
They're not just a bunch of people who vote Democrat in prisons. It affects everybody. It affects the family members of these people who are going through systems and things like that. I think on the other side of it, with legislators, a lot of times they would like people to believe it is a straight up and down issue. They would like people to believe that all Democrats vote for reform and being easier on people who commit crimes or people who are convicted of crimes, and all Republicans are just tough on crime and they have no understanding, but that is not the case. A lot of times it takes people having a personal connection to different things, have understanding of what goes on in different systems. So it's never been Republican versus Democrat. It is humanity versus humanity. We're not just locking away one side of the political realm, right? And I think that's what people fail to realize when in 2016, when the fight was on for voting rights for people who had been disenfranchised, there was a lot of conversation about, oh, we're giving all of these Democrats the right and we're stacking the vote. But what people didn't realize is there were a lot of people who voted Republican who benefited from being enfranchised again. So that's something really important to understand, that it's not just a party thing. And nobody asks. Nobody asks, what party line are you on when we reinstate your rights or when we take your rights away? You lose your right if you are convicted of a felony offense, period.
Sounds like the conversation on the ground may look a little bit different than the conversation on cable news. Silas, why don't you go ahead and jump in?
Well, honestly, that was really related to exactly what I was thinking about as well. It seems like what you're saying, Sheba, is that there's a lot of people on either side of the aisle or any other place along the political spectrum who are affected by this. But then when it gets to politicians, it gets turned into a partisan issue. And I just wonder, as that dynamic plays out, it really reminds me of many other issues that I've cared about where, everyday people are not as hostile to each other as the politicians seem to be, but we seem to be caught in that trap. And I wonder if you found ways of building bipartisan coalitions at the level of the politicians, because it seems like there's this disjuncture. And I guess from my viewpoint, and I'm curious, you know a lot more than me, from my viewpoint, at the partisan politician level, it does become very left-right. It's like you have on the voting rights issues, really stark Republican Democrat kind of lining up legislator-wise. And I wonder if you found any techniques to break through that, especially given the reality that people on the ground affected by this aren't all one party.
So not very much success in it, but I think the best example is abolishing the death penalty this last special session. It absolutely became an issue where both sides weighed in and made it happen. And what happened, we talked to victims of crime. We talked to people who had been impacted by someone who was a capital murder suspect, myself included. I lost a good friend and her 15-year-old son were killed in 2017 by her husband. It was a capital murder case. He ended up taking a plea for life in prison, but we talked to people who would normally oppose abolishing the death penalty. It took the group effort to make this happen. It didn't just happen with just because we had Democratic majority. It happened because people who had really been impacted by these issues stepped up and testified and said, listen, I don't get any resolve from seeing a person murdered by the state. And that was like a huge example of setting aside differences and listening to a person in their perspective and being open to understanding that all people are impacted by these things. It's not just one party over the other, because these things happen in our community and nobody is thinking about, well, okay, I'm Republican, I'm not gonna shoot up a school today. I'm Democrat, I'm not gonna shoot up a school today. Mental health is an issue for everybody. All of the different things that impact the different legal systems is an issue for everybody. And if we're looking at the broader picture, when a person is released from incarceration, they come home, they don't look and say, do I live in this neighborhood next to this person who is a Republican? They don't. They don't look at a party affiliation at all. It becomes it becomes a political thing when we go to bat for changes and reform. Like addressing the war on drugs is something that has plagued our country. And it didn't start in 1994 with Biden and Harris. It started with the Nixon administration and Reagan and different things like that. The Highway Safety Act that says that we don't get federal funding if we don't keep a person's DUI on record for 11 years came way before the 1994 crime bill. So when we have people who go to prison and come home, it is a community issue, because if that person can't go to work and you're impacted by these things, whether you believe it or not, if you don't have someone who has directly been in the systems, you are a taxpayer who pays dollars to build new prisons and juvenile justice facilities. You are a person who pays taxes for people who can't get hired, even with all their credentials and degrees, and they go to sign up for Medicaid or SNAP or TANF. Either you are paying for it in your tax dollars or you are paying for it with political capital and blood, sweat, and tears because you have a loved one who's been impacted by these systems. So there are a lot of people who will say it is Democrat versus Republican, but it's absolutely not.
Well, and certainly a lot of
sorry, John, do you want to go with me?
I was just going to make the remark that certainly a lot of the policies that set the stage, in many people's opinions, at least, for the problems of mass incarceration, some of the effects that you're working to counter, Sheba, were bipartisan policies, right? And so it makes sense that the solutions, we should open up our minds to the idea that they could be bipartisan as well and work in that direction. But that's just a comment. Silas, go ahead and jump in.
Well, the thing that I heard you say, Sheba, and I really wanted to pause on this as something, to my mind, crucial to the conversation, is that the ability to get beyond sort of political posturing and get to real changes is based on centering the lived experiences of people who have gone through the system, and that seems to be central to what Braver Angels does. Also, so much of what Braver Angels does is take a political stereotype of somebody on the other side and then ask you to talk to a real person and hear what they actually think and feel, and then suddenly you feel differently about the issue. Having said that, what strikes me as one of the most challenging things about issues around incarceration is our society has set it up so that it is impossible to access people who are incarcerated. My wife is a pastor, and she used to do pastoral work in a prison. It took months for her to even just be allowed to step foot in the place. And every time it was this huge process. And, ultimately she wasn't able to provide a 1/10 the services or the care pastorally that she would have to people in that circumstance, because of all the ways we've made it impossible to even see the people who are behind bars. And then when people come out of the system, very often they're relegated to the margins of society because they can't get a job or they can't, be part of the political process or things like that. And so once again, people are hidden from view. So I guess I just wonder if you could speak to how do we overcome that element of hiding from view, removing from the conversation the people who are most impacted by the policies themselves.
So I can't say that Virginia's Department of Corrections has gotten better with allowing people who are impacted by these systems to be volunteers in the system. I'm a statewide volunteer. It took some time. It took getting fingerprinted at a Virginia State Police headquarters, which was, a little traumatizing in itself. But going in, I connect with the different reentry councils who are headed kind of by parole and probation, who see these people when they first step foot out of prisons. But it's not an easy thing. Like you said, they are hidden from view. I believe like when people go into prisons, it's really easy to forget those individuals and not connect with them. You see a lot of people who have family who has disconnected, and we work really hard to do family reunification and building, not just when they step outside of that facility, but while they're still incarcerated. So it's a difficult thing, but we have to kind of be creative about how we connect with people. We set up JPay, which, if people don't know, that is the system that takes money away from families to communicate with their loved ones. And it is absolutely something that preys on people who have loved ones in the system. But those are our options: write letters or send emails through JPay or connect through phone calls. Difficult because if sometimes if you're sending literature in, they make it really difficult to send things in. They make copies of cards and like postcards, and sometimes your communication doesn't get in when it's supposed to. But patience. We have a ton of patience. We have a ton of volunteers who do the work. Like I remember for like Father's Day, we did an event where we did postcards just to send people like, well messages, but it's not easy. And it's not designed to be easy. Even though we say rehabilitation is the goal, you separate people, you send them to faraway places, you have them in rural communities where people sometimes don't even have access to get to their loved ones to see them, even if they wanted to. So it is by design, and it is very much a challenge that so many people face. And sometimes people don't have the strength or the resiliency to stay connected. But it benefits everybody to make sure that people are connected to other humans so that they're prepared for returning to our communities. Because if people don't know, 95% of those people who go into facilities return to our communities at some point.
Mm-hmm. And Sheba, to follow that up, you spoke to the human connection, which I think is so important. What about how this affects the political representation piece? How, for example, have you entered into the space as somebody who was wrongfully convicted, but still, people will still say, oh, well, you were convicted, right? That's the very thing we were talking about with job applications. Entering into a political space, going into political conversations, how is your experience as a person who has members of your family who've been incarcerated, who has a conviction on their record? How's your experience going into political spaces been shaped by that identity and how people reacted to you?
So a big thing that I want people to understand is I am a person who has a past conviction, and I specifically say I am a person first. I have a past conviction. I also have a college degree. I also am a mother and a sister and a wife, and I am someone in the community who a lot of people look up to. That is one facet of my character, but it is not something that should define me. So when we talk about people who have past convictions, who go into the spaces to share their experiences, it is becoming more acceptable. And I contribute that to us having the power to vote now. We were largely ignored. And I won't say that we were voiceless, we were muted. We weren't voiceless because we've always had opinions and obligations, but we're able to vote for people who represent our kids on school boards. We're able to vote for people who are on city council and our governors and our presidents and, all of the different people who represent us. And it's not something that has been happening for a long time. This just recently happened. Like, we are in the middle of this constitutional amendment to make sure that people who are on probation can vote. So for a long time, when you see all of the politicians go and send mailers out to different houses and knock on different doors, they use different apps like mobile van and different things like that. And if they don't see a voting history, they pass by your house.
Mhm.
They pass by sending you messages as if you're not a part of this community. But as we start to move forward to make sure that everybody in the community is able to utilize their vote, now they have to do more groundwork and talk to people who come from more diverse backgrounds. And what I tell people, especially people whose rights we help get reinstated, you don't just get the right to vote. You get the right to serve on juries. You get the right to run for political office and be a notary public. Utilize that. And if you do not like what you see in front of you, be the person who makes the change. So people who are in the political space have to expand their horizons a lot of times. But I'll share like what happens. A lot of times we will go into the General Assembly, and last year has all been virtual, but we will go into General Assembly and we will speak about our experiences as people who have been convicted, people who have crimes, and we have to listen to people use words like ex-offender and felon and violent or non-violent, or they judge and they point the finger based on what you have done in the past, and they disregard all of the things that you have done that are successful. I own every facet of my life and everything that I am described as, but I rise above all of the negativity, right? There are still people who don't look at individuals who have been convicted as people. But at the end of the day, we are all people. There are a ton of people who have things on their record or in their past that they're not proud of, or maybe they did not even do. Because if people don't know, like in Virginia, like many other states, if you are charged with a crime, if you are arrested for a crime, your Virginia state background has your arrest record, not just your conviction record. So you're judged a lot of times, and I'm talking about with employers and housing managers, you are judged based on something that you're fighting against. They're not even looking to say, oh, you were convicted of this thing. They say, oh, you were arrested and you could potentially be a threat in the future. We can't house you, or we can't employ you. So I think it's a learning lesson to say we have to look at people as people. We can't just keep judging by one instance in their life, because people are so much more than a conviction.
Indeed. On the Nolef Turns website, I think that you talk some about how it is that employment is vital because it grounds a person in their relationships to I'm not quoting directly, but in their relationships to the community around them, right? And even as you were talking about the restoration of the right to vote, you didn't just articulate that in terms of, oh, now I get to vote on voting day, but rather that you get to do all of these other things that allows you to participate in civic society, serving on juries, et cetera. And of course, suddenly now you're also visible to politicians and so forth who need to campaign for votes. Wondering if you can just speak a little bit to that theme to give people a sense of psychologically what people are dealing with in the current sort of landscape of circumstances where you come out, it's incredibly difficult to get a job because you have this mark on your record. Depending on the law, you're not able to engage civically, and suddenly you don't have the easy ways of being able to participate in society. Explain to us sort of psychologically and emotionally why that matters, why this is about more than people just being able to pay the bills, getting out of prison, or being able to cast a vote.
So I'll paint this picture. If I do the time that the judge and or jury say is sufficient for whatever crime I'm convicted of. Say, for instance, the judge says, oh, you have to pay $5,000 in fines and fees. You do 5 years in prison, maybe 3 years on probation. You lose your right to vote as soon as you get this conviction. Do these things. I go to prison. I get trades while I'm in prison. I maintain a balance of family and keep in touch with like my loved ones and the friends that are there. I am released and I'm on probation. I have to report to a probation officer. I have to be subject to submitting urine samples at will, at random. Sometimes my probation officer may show up at my house, or if I get a job, they may show up at my job randomly to say, "Oh, I just want to make sure that you were working," which gives people um, wandering eyes. They want to know, like, why do you have someone showing up at this job? You always have to be on edge. So say, for instance, you get out and you put in applications. There are some employers that just throw it away. There are some employers who say, we don't hire people at all. They say, we'll make a judgment based on how the interview goes, because in some places we have ban the box, right?
Mhm.
Ban the box was good in theory, but it's problematic in the fact that say you take a job because you have to provide for your kids and your family and things like that. You take a job and you're looking for something better. So you're working at this job, you come to work every day, been on time, you do all the things, you're a great employee, and you're looking for another job that pays you more maybe or has better benefits. You go on this interview, you do great, you are qualified, you have all the credentials, you do all the things, and they say, well, tell me about this past conviction. You talk about the conviction, they know what's at stake. They'll ask you all the questions about a conviction, and then they say, this interview went well, you're the most qualified person, we're going to offer you a job pending a background check. Now, you had a conversation about what was on your background check. They say, we give you a job offer. To me, I hear, I can give 2 weeks notice at this other job so that my flow of income can stop, because sometimes I'm living paycheck to paycheck
Sure.
and I'm trying to build, like, and your background checks comes back. It has exactly what you discussed with this employer on it. And they say, well, we can't give you this job. Now you've quit another job because they told you that you've been offered this job and now you're without. And if you're without and you're on probation, sometimes that may be enough to get you violated, because the terms of your probation are that you are gainfully employed all the time. So there's always a constant stressor. There's always something that says, am I going to have to answer this question? Because every application that you see has a question about a past conviction. If you want to be a volunteer at your kid's school, if you want to be a chaperone at your kid's school, if you want to serve on different committees or go into different spaces, if you want to work, at certain facilities or volunteer for different things, they always come to this question about a past conviction. And everybody says, oh, be honest, and you're honest, and you're still penalized for it. So you live with this thing. You have to make decisions, because if you have a family, and it may not just be kids, it may be, your mother. Like, you may be released from incarceration. You don't qualify for certain housing for 7 to 10 years sometimes. And for people who don't know, HUD has a so-called protection that says that there can't be a blanket discrimination against people who have past convictions, but you're absolutely able to say, we looked at it on a case-by-case basis and no, we can't rent to you. So every challenge is there. And it's like, there are protections for so many things, but not for a person who has a past conviction. And if we're being realistic, 1 in 3 adults in America has a past conviction, right? So we're essentially discriminating against 33% of the country for something that they have already paid their quote unquote debt to society for. And it is legal. It is legal to have collateral consequences, which are things that come after the sentence, things that come after you have done your time and paid your fines and fees or restitution or whatever debts there are that we say is sufficient. So what we're essentially doing is saying, we're never going to let go of this one instance in your life that happened. So there's always a constant challenge to be the best, be better than the best, because you always have to answer to this question.
Sheba, I want to, first off, thank you for sharing all that. I mean, I feel like just hearing you walk through the daily life experience, I think it's very, very visceral. You can feel what it would be like to just feel like at any moment you could kind of fall through a crack and then be unable to ever get back. And I just want to thank you for sharing all that first. And I wanted to ask you to connect this question to what I think is the elephant in the room whenever there's a conversation around the penal system, the incarceration system, is the issue of race. For those who don't know, Sheba first came to a Braver Angels event speaking at one of our debates on HR 1, which is the voting law, and gave a very passionate speech and powerful speech that talked about the connection of our nation's voting laws to issues of race.
Good evening, everybody. My name is Sheba Williams. I am the founder of Nolef Turns in Richmond, Virginia. I will look to history to explain my support of HR 1. America prides itself on being a country where all men are created equal, yet they have historically been inequities in race, wealth, social equity, education, housing and food access, and most significantly, voting rights. 402 years ago, slavery began on a small colony in Virginia, now known as Jamestown. I was born and raised in Richmond, Virginia, the capital of the Confederacy and a state that staunchly supported slavery, poll taxes, literacy tests, Black codes, Jim Crow laws, lynching, mass incarceration, and felony disenfranchisement. In 1902, Virginia held a convention that brought together many legislators to address voting rights. And according to Carter Glass, the most significant goal was to disenfranchise as many newly freed slaves as possible. We have essentially eliminated slavery, poll taxes, literacy tests, Black codes, and most Jim Crow laws. But tonight, on the 1-year anniversary of the murder of George Floyd, we know that lynching, mass incarceration, and felony disenfranchise still exist. 6.1 million Americans have a felony conviction. Prior to 2021, Vermont, Maine, and the District of Columbia were the only states where people lost their voting rights did not lose their voting rights unless they were deemed to be morally inept to make civic decisions about their own lives. That includes school board, city council, House, Senate, and presidential candidates. The For the People Act is one of the most transformative democracy reforms in more than 4 decades that seeks to protect the rights of all people. We know that voting rights of the most vulnerable Americans have constantly been under attack since the inception of this country. Purging voter rolls has long since been a tool to disenfranchise otherwise eligible voters. Campaign finance, ethics, and accountability reform is necessary because transparency and special interest has guided many of the most well-intended bills for centuries. If we all love this country and believe that all people should be afforded the right to civic engagement, then we will vote for HR 1 and protect it at all costs to ensure that all people truly are able to engage in the civic process.
Could you tell us a little bit about this and speak to how you see the issues of race and incarceration interacting, and where you think we can go as a country to move forward around that point specifically?
So race has always been an issue. If we're going back to the root of mass incarceration, and I always say mass incarceration is slavery by another name. There are white people who are incarcerated. There are Hispanic and Asian people who are incarcerated, but the overwhelming majority of individuals who are incarcerated are Black and brown people in a system. And it is no secret that we get over-policed more, we get overcharged more, we are over-incarcerated more. And that is just all we can say to that. When we're talking about opportunities to thrive, who gets offered jobs sometimes, people will say it's not race related, but if you look at the dynamics of different companies and corporations, you will see that there is no diversity. There is a lower population of Black and brown people who are employed. There was redlining. There was a very intentional move to gentrify neighborhoods, and gentrification isn't about Black people taking over communities where white people used to thrive. It is very intentional acts of menace to take away from Black communities who thrive. When we're talking about every facet of life, race is an issue, whether people want to believe it or not. Our prisons are filled with 3 times more Black and brown people than white people, even if they commit crimes at the same rates. And that has always been an issue. And we're coming to a point of reckoning in our country with the war on drugs. And the war on drugs has been centered a lot in changing policies, not just getting rid of things, but making atones for how we treated Black and brown people in the past. You will hear a lot of politicians run on their campaign to say we have to find ways to be more equitable, not just equal, but equitable to Black and brown people who have been intentionally targeted in the past and have been arrested in the past and who live with convictions in the past. Race may be something that people disregard, but it is not something to brush off and pretend as if it's not a very real thing, because we know that opinions are formed about people of color based on personal bias a lot of times, a lot more than others. And like even in reentry work that I do, I see my white individuals who I work with get placed in jobs faster, get placed in housing faster. They may have the same crimes, but they get opportunities faster than a lot of our people of color who we work with. So that is just being honest about where we stand. And if we're going back through history, we know that with slavery, people were disenfranchised intentionally. In our 1902 convention here in Virginia, there was a statement by Carter Glass that said, slavery was ended, but we have to be as intentional as possible about disenfranchising the darky, which is in reference to Black people who were newly freed slaves. That cycle has gone on since the beginning of time. We had Jim Crow laws, we had Black codes, we had different voter suppression tactics, we had lynching. All of these things flow into more modern and updated means of taking away from resources and making sure that race is centered in everything that we do.
I want to give it to John next, but I do want to just address one piece of that that came up there, which was in talking about the way in which race feeds through all these systems. You know, I think that there'll be some people, and I'm just going to say this, is certainly not my opinion, but I'm going to say it because I think it's important to get out there. We'll say, people think that's the case, and it used to be the case, but it's not the case anymore. But I want to just give one example related to what you said when you talked about your experience that the white returning citizens that you're working with get job placements at higher rates than the Black returning citizens, even if they have been convicted for the same crime. There was actually an experiment done that had letters sent to people asking for a job by a white man, a purported white man. It was an experiment, so it wasn't real. You know, a purported white man who had claimed to have been convicted of actually second-degree murder, and a Black man who claimed to be convicted of car theft. And the white man got, the imaginary white man in the study got more job request applications back or offers for assistance, which I just think, you know, it's really interesting because someone could say, well, you know, I don't see that in my workplace. But when you look at it in an example of, like, you know, a population who's returning from incarceration, what assumptions are people bringing to the same crime, to the same person, to the same circumstances? So, John, I'll be happy to pass it to you. I know that you've been waiting for a while.
No, that's fine. I wish we had enough time to go deeper on this particular subject, because obviously the policies that we're talking about connect to a history that is fraught with injustice, and the current controversy, the current conversation I think that we're having in America today revolves in part around, well, just how directly does that history actually bear upon current policies, current ways in which people are treated in the country. And your experience is valuable, Sheba, in part because you have an on-the-ground sort of vantage point from which to assess some of these things. And so I just want to say that going forward, my hope is that, I mean, folks in the Braver Angels community have already heard from you. They'll hear from you again in this podcast. My hope is that there's more we can do to bring your voice to the conversation in concert with others going forward. And along those lines, as we move towards a close here, my question for you, Sheba, is, so in the work of Braver Angels, of course, what we strive to do is to give people the opportunity to show up in the full authenticity of who they are, in their identities and their politics, et cetera, for the purposes not of clubbing each other to death in arguments and debates that are really just people shouting past each other, but in the context of our sharing our experiences alongside our convictions so we can understand one another better, even as we try and reason past our disagreements to move forward on issues that matter. And so what I'd like to ask is, how is it that do you see your experience and the experience that you have working on the ground with returning citizens as having lessons for broader America and broader society in terms of how we can treat each other in a way, communicate with each other in a way that allows us to make progress in the areas where it matters most, and to basically respect each other as human beings with compassion and empathy and understanding for the differences that exist between us in our life experience? Are there lessons that you can pull from your work to share with the folks who are listening to us today?
The most important thing is seeing people as people. We don't do labels. We try to stray away from labeling people by what they've done and looking at the potential of where people are. And sometimes that takes people who have different viewpoints and vantage points, but we still don't disregard the elephant in the room or the hard questions. It is completely understandable to have a person who does not see things your way and still be able to respect what they feel and where they come from, and try to reach a happy compromise with people who don't feel how I feel about having heart-to-heart work with people who have been convicted of certain things. Some of our greatest allies surprise people because I have the most diehard people who say, I believe in crime and punishment, and I believe that, people can't be rehabilitated. Be open to conversations with people who have been convicted. We had an instance where a young man was convicted and sentenced to 50 years for a car accident. Now, on paper, he has been convicted of a violent offense. But if you meet this young man who is a young, vibrant 22-year-old now who has autism, who is skilled in playing the piano, who has all of these gifts and skills to bring to the conversation in the room and the relationships, they have a conversation with them and they say things like, what I hear a lot is, you don't seem like a person who has been convicted of a crime. You don't seem like a person who has autism. You have to look past what you think a person is and dive into building real one-to-one relationships. You can't generalize a population of people, and the people who are fighting for things like I fight for have to understand that we can't just be one-sided on our debate, and we can't just hear things that we want to hear and disregard the very real concerns of people who may not be where we are in terms of forgiveness. But at the center and core of it all is being willing to listen and be open-minded, being willing to understand that this could be you at any given moment, or your loved one, or somebody you really care about, and how would you want them to be able to act and engage in society once they've gotten to this point.
Well, that sounds like Braver Angels wisdom to me. So, Sheba, I really appreciate you sharing that with us and just sharing your story, and giving us a window into who you are as a person and the heart required for doing the work that you do. It is a powerful testimony to the ways in which we can draw from the pains of our experiences in order to enrich the life of others. And so it's about time for us to take it to a close. Silas, is there anything that you want to say in closing here before we wrap up officially?
Yeah, just a couple of things. I mean, for one, I think for anybody who wants to learn more about Sheba and her work, you can check out her organization's website, Nolef Turns. Nolef is the word felon backwards. NolefTurns.org. One T, not two.
And we'll include.
You can also Google Sheba.
And we'll include a link.
Wonderful, yeah.
Below. Yeah.
And then you can also Google Sheba. She's been in the news more than once for her tremendous work. I'd also just say I'd love it if we could link in the notes here the speech in which Sheba spoke, but also Braver Angels is continuing an ongoing set of conversations about race, which as relates to many different issues, particularly whether our society is moving forward and how. So actually tomorrow night we'll be debating whether America is a racist nation. And so Sheba, I'd love for you to tune into that one and see what people have to say there. And I hope that many of our listeners will tune in there also. Lastly, I'll just say thank you to Sheba. I met Sheba several years back now. I was doing a training about nonprofit fundraising, and of all the people in the room, there was somebody who just really followed up with me and said, okay, I'd love to continue working with you. And I just had a sense, I think that they're serious. And sure enough, Sheba was the kind of person who, when she said something, she was going to do it. And we struck up a friendship through that. And I've been just really blessed to know you, Sheba. And I really am so glad to be able to support you in your work and be able to share that work with people in our community here at Braver Angels. So thank you so much for being with us here today.
Absolutely. Always happy to connect. It is my duty to turn people into believers, and no matter what a person's circumstances are, have people see others as human beings. And if they can get to that point, then we can get rid of this mass incarceration problem. But here we are, 2021, trying to change the world with one person at a time. So thank you all for having me.
There you go. There you go. And thank you for being with us. And so, folks, if you want to keep up with Sheba Williams, and I encourage you to do so, you can see links to her work in the description below. And for those of you who are not yet members of Braver Angels, who see what it is that we are doing, who are interested in the work of rebuilding the bonds of civic democracy between the American people and restoring the relationships that allow our country to thrive, then join us. Join us as a member at braverangels.org and like, share, and subscribe to this podcast. Don't forget, we are building a house united. Until next time. Thank you, folks.